Welcome to this lecture on historical sociology and the varieties of capitalism. So, historical sociology is another sub-branch of sociology, and the so-called varieties of capitalism approach from 2001 is one application where historical sociology is much used. It's basically a subdiscipline also of a subject called political economy that tries to make sense of differences across different capitalist economic systems. So, to start with, why do we need historical sociology? Isn't there history already? Historians do history, sociologists do sociology. Well, if you think about it, then many of the contemporary phenomena of the societies we live in have roots in the often very distant history, historical time periods, such that if we want to understand our current societies, it makes often sense to go down basically the historical trail and find like answers in history. One such example, for instance, is this work by economic historians, in fact, who, in this interesting recently published article, try to make sense of economic development using basically the satellite images of nightlight, which may be used as a proxy for economic development. If you see more like lights on a map from satellite images, then you may also expect that there's more economic development going on in those regions. And here on this map, which is taken from their article, you see basically this contemporary nightlight map of Europe and Northern Africa in this case. And on top of it, you see a display of the Roman Empire here in yellow borders, in what, almost its most expansive moment in history, and the network of major Roman roads. And the authors make the claim that to understand economic development, even up to the current day, across different regions in Europe, North America, it makes sense to go back even to the Roman Empire and the legacy of public infrastructure investment at the time. Well, historical sociology might also be relevant because many institutions that are still governing our lives in the current day are very old, and they persist even through multiple regime changes. And one of the authors that we will deal with today very often, the MIT political scientist Kathy Phelan, wrote this interesting book here in 2004 where she describes how basically the vocational training system that was developed in the time of Bismarck in the late 19th century was able to survive all of the chaotic stages of German history, the Weimar Republic, the Nazi period, and even then the divided and reunified Germany. So up to the current day, there's a vocational training system in Germany that is co-organized by unions and employer associations in the state and involves part schooling, which you see here on the left-hand side, and part it involves just on-the-job training in companies, so kind of internships. And this is an evolving institution which was put into place by Bismarck and basically conservative politicians in the German Empire before the First World War to, in a way, accommodate the laboring classes in the new capitalist system to create something like a Mittelstand, so kind of a middle class that wouldn't rebel against capitalism. And each of the following sort of regimes made use of this vocational training system as an institution that also served their purposes. So to the current day, this system is hailed to keep youth unemployment low, German mid-sized companies, hidden world export champions, and so on. So an institution basically that survives generations and is still with us today and can explain why, for instance, countries that do have a similar vocational training system nowadays have less youth unemployment, as is, for instance, the case in Southern Europe, where such a system has not similarly evolved. Last but not least, so differences between countries and regions that you can observe today are often century old. So you create a system like a ranking of cities or regions or countries by population size, economic performance, also the structure, demographic structure. We saw religion, for instance, in this lecture already, but also the number of suicides. And this ranking then of cities or regions remains often quite stable over time. Yeah. So the suicide rates or the percentage of Catholics we had in Europe or the United States. But I mean, think also about GDP development. Here again, drawing on the Madison GDP per capita data by different world regions. And of course, there are always, in a way, path breakers that destroy the ranking. But if you just calculate, for instance, a rank correlation coefficient of a region 500 years ago, and nowadays you may still find correlations. Yeah. So all of these reasons may explain and motivate why sociologists as well should sometimes use, let's say, more historical explanations because they allow to still make sense of contemporary phenomena. One important concept in explaining the persistency of phenomena over time is path dependence. And path dependence is more than just saying that, let's say, history matters. Yeah? So that a bit tautologically speaking, the past influences the present. If you think about causal statements, they obviously always involve a cause that precedes an effect in time. So just saying that basically yesterday's developments were important for today's is not sufficient. So path dependence is a more elaborate kind of explanation. And let's go through the different elements that James Mahoney so nicely formalized in this mandatory reading for today. So a path dependency explanation consists of at least three different elements, the first of which is the identification of a critical juncture. Yeah? So this is somewhat the start, also the chronological start of a path dependency explanation. So this is an event where, in a way, I mean, think about like a fork, right, in a historical evolution chart where history just takes a certain direction and not an alternative one, and basically sets a country, a city, a company, or even an individual on a certain path. Yeah. So you may also think in terms of examples here, not just about countries or political systems and their developments, but you may simply apply this also to your own biography, where there are usually in biographies also these path dependencies that start with these critical moments. Yeah? You meeting someone at a critical moment in life, right? Decision, which subject to study, like first hire at a company, um, and so on. And this may all be a critical juncture. It's a bit of a chance event. It could turn the other way, but it's a small event that may then have like time-wise distant effects and also potentially large effects. Yeah? Think again about your own professional choice. It's a choice you may do when you're around 20, and then it determines basically your professional life until you retire. Okay, a second element in these path-dependent explanations are then self-reinforcing mechanisms of different sorts, and we will dive a bit more into these different kinds on the next slide. Um, these self-reinforcing mechanisms basically make sure that a certain development, the critical juncture, steered basically an institution, a person, a firm into remains on track. And this self-reinforcing mechanism is characterized by something that economists also refer to as increasing returns, which describes a situation where, yeah, once you entered a certain path, you are continuously rewarded on that path. Yeah. So one typical example for these path dependence explanations are technological choices. So think about you choosing Windows versus Apple. You started simply with Windows, and now you are increasingly rewarded, or maybe not, given that it's a Windows, but you are basically getting all of these, let's say, additional returns on your Windows investments. You start investing into Windows-specific software and skills. You spend more time with Windows. So you get all of these returns given your Windows investment that makes it more and more difficult for you to still switch operating system to switch to Apple. Yeah. So in the applications of path dependency in more political science context, the term positive feedback effects is also used, which describes a bit of the same phenomenon. Once you have settled for a certain choice, then there are in a way feedback loops that reinforce also that choice. And we will see in a second also how this applies to concrete examples. Last but not least, this constant reinforcing leads to a situation where basically an equilibrium point is used and there's a certain lock-in the path that was chosen. So in this Windows example, you just stick to Windows. Basically, this is where you invested all of your programs, now all of your skills, so you remain with Windows. So one like classical application of such a path dependence explanation that consists of these three elements is the QWERTY keyboard, which you all know, which is here printed again on the right-hand side. So this is the basically English keyboard, which originally was designed for typewriters, right? And at the time, it wasn't clear how to arrange the different letters of the alphabet on the keyboard. And there was one competing system with the QWERTY system, which is described simply as the sort of letters you see here in the upper row, which on the English keyboard read QWERTY. So at the time, there was also an alternative system that is called Dvorak, or that was called Dvorak, which had the advantage that it had more letters in one row that you would also type more frequently together given the English language at least, which the QWERTY system did not have. And you might wonder why letters were arranged in this rather, let's say, unintuitive way on the keyboard. Now we all use it, but well, why would you arrange it as such in the first place? It wasn't arranged basically by increasing typing efficiency necessarily, because as you may notice, many of the letters that you often basically type together in a word are not necessarily right next to each other. But it was rather developed for typewriters actually to not jam their arms, right? You remember the typewriters basically were made to really mechanically move an arm to print a letter on a paper. And once letters were too close together, and then these two arms tended to jam. So this is one, well, the major reason for the arrangement of letters on the QWERTY keyboard. So, so when typewriters were still an innovation, it wasn't clear then which kind of letter arrangement you would use. And then it was basically through some initial first mover advantages of the QWERTY keyboard, better marketing strategy, etc., that brought the QWERTY keyboard a little bit ahead of the Dvorak one. And this is basically the critical juncture of the explanation. The self-reinforcing mechanism then set in because once you have set of vocational training and personal use, company investment into the QWERTY keyboard, everyone sort of gets accustomed to it, and the QWERTY keyboard establishes itself somehow as the technological standard. So the switch to the Dvorak system becomes more and more costly. Yeah, you have to redesign textbooks, vocational training. You basically then have to retrain the people who already got used to the QWERTY system. So after then this self-reinforcing mechanism of like network effects of this technology, then this third phase sort of sets in where you have a technological lock-in. Now, I mean, there are still some alternative keyboards around, but QWERTY is sort of the number one um, keyboard around, even though from an efficiency point of angle, it is not the best choice. So there are systems that allow you apparently to type more efficiently. So basically, this leaves us then with a three-phase, also chronological model of these path dependency explanations where, I mean, you have here on the Y scale a range of potential options, and initially everything is more or less unpredictably around and the same. And from this initial phase, it's basically not predictable which of the choices will eventually create a path, like in this case, a path of technological adoption. So this is often determined by chance events and very insignificantly small events. When, let's say here, companies, for instance, compete, there is this important phase of initial positive feedback, right? So your company buys these typewriters and your personal typewriter choice, then it's the same kind of model. And there are these different feedback effects. We will take a look at these in a second. And last but not least, this basically one technological option is around. So technological choice is one of the, let's say, classical application examples of path dependency, often used also in innovation economics. But you may, as I said, apply it as well to, let's say, regimes in political science, to institutions in sociology, or even to biographical development. Yeah. So I think let's visualize the main points of path dependence explanations again. So all starts basically with this chance event, right? So um, this initial, if you want, the tipping point. Yeah, where does this lottery ball in a way fall? Yeah, and this may be driven by chance. It's not predictable, at least not ex ante. And then in the second stage, however, it leads basically to this amplification effect, right? The snowball effect here gets bigger and bigger. Um, and basically, once you're here, graphically speaking, you won't think about rolling up this ball again to the very top. And then at the end, you reach a situation like a one-way kind of street where, I mean, if you go the one direction, it's fine. But then when you go back here with these very unnice barriers here in the way, yeah, you definitely have to face a cost. Yeah, that's when your company then needs to switch from Windows to Apple. You change your professional choice at the age of 40. You notice that sociology wasn't that great after all. I switched to economics. Yeah, so or a state basically after a revolution switches from socialism to market capitalism, and all of these late sort of choices only come at considerable cost. And it is basically this cost and this which also keeps um, uh, then a company, a state, or a person on track of a certain path. So let's take a closer look at the different mechanisms that may keep someone on the path. And let's use the QWERTY example. So there are four different ones: utilitarian, the functional, power, or legitimation kind of reinforcing mechanism. So the utilitarian one we implicitly already mentioned, that is an institution like this QWERTY keyboard is reproduced through the rational cost benefit assessment of actors, right? So the company notices simply, okay, if I stick to QWERTY, then all of my employees just don't have to switch to a different technology, don't have additional training costs. It's just rational, just from a cost benefit analysis to remain on that path. It may be the case here that QWERTY is less efficient in comparison to the Dvorak, but yeah, it's too late to switch by now. Yeah. And you may wonder whether there's even a chance to switch sort of the paths at all to go off a certain track. And the mechanism here would probably be just, I mean, external shocks, of course, but also if there's too much competitive pressure. So a functional kind of reinforcing mechanism would basically see the QWERTY institution here as reproduced because it just serves a function, right? It works, it's sort of in place. And if you want an institutional reproduction is possible also thanks to the QWERTY institution. Again, this might be less functional than the previous one, but it just keeps to be used. A power explanation would see a reinforcing mechanism in the kind of actors that also are grouped around here a certain institution or technology, and that just have just the power to make this institution more persistent. And you may think here of, I mean, now Microsoft, for instance, being almost a monopolist, at least regionally in many instances. So it has a very high market share, and it can use the power, for instance, to buy up smaller competitors. to use any kind of lobbying as well, to keep, I don't know, government institutions on Microsoft computers. And basically power is one way of how the initially, let's say, inefficient second best kind of solution or institution is made permanent over time. Last but not least, legitimation explanations basically refer to a feedback mechanism that draws on the idea that any institution, in order to survive, needs legitimation, right? It needs to be justified for most of the users, most of the members of the institutions. I mean, here we get back a bit to a point that Berger-Luckmann described in their account of institutions. If you are basically born into an institution, if you take it like for granted already, then the mere, let's say, factual presence of an institution might already create, in a way, a normative persuasion and a normative power. Yeah, you just think that any institution around that you know basically from birth is the default institution that is not just there by any chance, but by it being justified. Yeah. So I think up to now you might have thought that the QWERTY keyboard is just justified due to it being the most efficient solution. And now you just learned that there are probably more efficient solutions around. And up to now, you haven't probably questioned the, let's say, legitimacy of the efficiency of this QWERTY keyboard. Yeah. So these four kind of, if you want, positive feedback mechanisms may explain why initially, let's say, less convincing choices can still have a life of their own and set institutions, firms, countries, individuals on a certain path that are difficult then to reverse only at very high cost. Okay, so when going back here to James Mahoney article, historical sociology is not just about path dependence explanations. Mahoney also mentions sequence analysis as a second kind of tool. And the idea behind reactive sequences is that these are chains of temporally ordered and causally connected events in a reactive sequence. Each event in the sequence is both a reaction to antecedent events and a cause of subsequent events. Early events in the sequence are especially important to final outcomes because a small change in one of these events can accumulate over time and make a great deal of difference by the end of the sequence, unquote. So let's compare sequence analysis to a normal causal analysis. So in a normal causal analysis, you would simply pick out a certain cause, get the effects, and this would be relatively independent of context. What sequence analysis is about is to say that it is not only about picking a certain cause, it's also about the timing of it. Yeah? And let's turn to one example to make this clearer. This is Alexander Gerschenkron's theory of economic backwardness. That's here in a volume of essays from the 1950s. Gerschenkron was an immigrant from Ukraine before the World War, ended up in Austria and eventually at Harvard. And his grandson wrote an almost Pulitzer Prize winning, very interesting biography about this very colorful scholar. But let's take a look at his basic idea of the theory of economic backwardness. Here, the application of the sequence analysis boils down to the fact that the timing of industrialization in this case determines basically a lot about the financial and economic political institutions that countries then afterwards differ by. Um, so industrialization started in the UK around 1750, and the UK and then the US following in the 19th century were characterized by having a lot of private capital and using securities markets to finance early industry. Securities markets are bond markets and stock markets. So they didn't have banks necessarily to finance industrialization, at least to a lesser degree. In the UK, there was a lot of merchant wealth around, and London was also one of the major early stock market, and this financed industry and led also to large securities markets. This is different than in late developing countries like Germany. So where industrialization started a little bit in the early 20th century, sorry, 19th century, and it was only towards the end of the 19th century then that Germany gradually also took over the UK. And how did it do so? Well, Gerschenkron argues that in order to get industrialization jump started, you need more centralized sources of capital in these late developing countries that lack capital. And the institution that provided them this capital, which was also founded with state help, were these big universal banks. The biggest one is still with us today. You all know the Deutsche Bank. Which was founded in the 1870s, 80s then to basically boost German exports already at that time. Yeah, and the timing becomes important here because given that particularly British products had already conquered the world market and British capital was dominant, the late developers couldn't just copy the British model because markets were already conquered. So the strategy then of late developers was rather to go into something that Wolfgang Streeck later called the diversified quality production. So rather to produce higher end products that require also perhaps more skill in the production process, and to basically compete on quality and not on price. And this is simply due to just this timing effect of the industrialization. Great Britain was already able to conquer markets, to accumulate more and more capital. So it wasn't possible necessarily to compete with Britain in the same gamut of products. And these, let's say, more centralized financial institutions like the Deutsche Bank were a part then of that financial structure determined by the timing of industrialization. This move towards more centralized capital becomes even clearer when looking at Gerschenkron's case for the very late developing countries like the USSR, where it was basically a socialist revolution that took over the state and finance, collectivized also investment, and tried to jumpstart industrialization in a real spurt, with all of the victims that this involved. And again, given the timing, the very late timing of this industrialization, only basically very centralized kind of capital was able to compete then with all of these other nations which by then had already occupied basically in the niches in production. So this explanation exemplifies this, let's say, second proposition of historical sociology of using sequence analysis in order to make sense of phenomena. And this is not just historical, because the difference between countries' way of financing companies, or right, either through securities markets, state-led or bank-led kind of markets, is still basically with us today. So when you look at the size of commercial banks, for instance, here, this is the total deposits relative to GDP in percent, then you see that basically the English legal origin countries, so the common law countries, are relatively behind here throughout the last sort of 100 years. Yeah? And this is very different when you look at the stock market capitalization, right? So the quantity times price of all stocks in a country divided by GDP then in percent. Then it's the other way around, that the common law countries in particular are leading in terms of how large their securities markets are. Yeah? And this difference between the bank-centered financial systems and the more stock market financial systems also visible when you look at savings banks, which are displayed here, where again it's rather the German legal systems countries that dominate. And also when it comes to state banking, where again the English or common law countries are rather behind. And these differences in financial systems, which I collected here myself as data, it's not published yet, then according to Gerschenkron, again, go back to very historical sequences of how countries reacted to industrialization. Okay, so path dependency has been around as a concept since about the 1980s and has also been criticized in its application to sociology. Let me just mention the most prominent critiques. First is that it's basically not able to explain institutional change other than through external shocks. And I mean, endogenously produced change is hard to explain. The model basically predicts too much stability given the changing nature of institutions that we do see. A second critique is that it doesn't account for gradual modes of change, right? So, in societies, many processes just take time. Think about bureaucracies or political processes. There are many obstacles in the way that make processes very long. And you probably all know this effect that when you see someone after a couple of years of not seeing that person, you're surprised at about the level of change that went on just like phenotypically in this person. And this is something you may not notice with someone you spend basically every day with, because change is just so gradual. And part of historical sociology then, as suggested here again by Kathy Thielen and Wolfgang Streeck, is about looking also at these gradual processes. And the two authors developed a nice typology, which I would like to present to you using an example from my own research, which is the gradual change of housing tenures. And this is the average of most countries in this world. So basically, there are three dominant modes of how you can live in your house or apartment. You can own it, and this is depicted here as the home ownership rate. You may just rent it from a private landlord here. This is depicted as the private rental rate in percentage point, or you may rented from, let's say, a social housing organization or the government, public housing. This is here the social rental rate, and all of this is in percent. And the three in this chart here, on average, add up to 100%. And what you see is that this is a gradual process over time. These are basically decade by decade points. So these are already 10 years, and you see about a century on the graph here. And you see a gradual increase of home ownership. We basically live here in dominantly home ownership societies globally. You basically see a decline of private rental with the exception of this last decade. And you see something like the rise and fall of social housing over time. Yeah. So how can we make sense of these more gradual moments in history? So in most of these countries, there were wars, there were regime changes, and yet there were very gradual moments of change. And here is a five-fold typology that Strick and Thielen proposed here in their book chapter of 2005, which I will briefly introduce to explain some of the changes that we just saw in the gradual long-term changes of housing tenure. And let's simply start here with the mode of institutional change that the authors call exhaustion. Yeah, so exhaustion refers to a gradual breakdown, like a withering away of institutions over time. Like a depletion in a way process. And in the case of housing, this can probably be best exemplified for social housing, which, as you saw, has been on decline in most countries over the last couple of decades. And perhaps the United States public housing is a case in point where this depletion process takes on a quite natural form, because ever since the start of public housing in the United States in 1937 during the New Deal time, the Republican Party has put certain cost limits to the support of public housing, which basically made it impossible to maintain public housing units properly, which over time naturally led to a gradual depletion, not just, I mean, of these buildings, but also of the institution. Because if you have basically a project with public housing units and half of them are already like badly maintained, this sets in motion all kinds of processes which eventually lead to an exhaustion of this institution. The second process the authors call conversion. So conversion is a bit of a more rapid change, right? Where in our example here, you basically redeploy old institution and give them a new purpose. Yeah? So we keep, in a way, a certain building or housing institution, but we rededicate its purpose. And one example here is that in countries like the UK, the formerly public housing called council houses have been gradually sold to the sitting tenants in so-called rights to buy programs initiated by Margaret Thatcher. You probably aren't surprised, as a way, to reduce public housing stock and to increase the privately traded, privately owned housing stock. Yeah? And in a way, the housing institution got completely reinterpreted here and made fit for a more market-based society. A third kind of mode of change is called drift by the authors. It's the neglect of institutional maintenance in spite of external change, resulting in slippage in institutional practice on the ground, deliberate neglect. Yeah? And here, again, one important application would be the disappearance of social housing through a degradation into badly maintained units, where basically you have a change in the social housing institutions due to a deliberate neglect. So Margaret Thatcher, for instance, didn't continue investing in the public or the council housing units, and thereby slowly making these units drift, if you want, to a kind of housing um, offer that was stigmatized uh, to basically pertain to the very poor parts of the populations only. Yeah? So that sitting tenants that bought the council houses were obviously rather tenants that were able to afford it, that also only bought the better units. So in a way, this led to deliberate neglect then also of the remaining council housing units, where you had more marginalized population that didn't actively lobby for better maintenance of the council houses. And eventually that drift then also supported the shift of housing provision in the UK towards more market-based provision. The fourth process here, layering, basically refers to a process to which new elements are attached to existing institutions and gradually change their status and structure. And well, in the case of housing institutions, think about this, for instance, as city growth, right? Which also adds layers, to the existing sort of housing stock. And in a way, it's often more difficult to change the core parts of a city right away. There are so many entrenched and vested interests, difficult to change. But through layering, you sort of can build these add-ons, yeah, institutionally, but also just spatially speaking. And yeah, for instance, you can extend a certain neighborhood that usually votes left for liberal parties by a neighborhood of single-family houses, and in the next sort of electoral sort of game or district, this is added to the former neighborhood and might shift the balance of power in the complete neighborhood just thanks to this additional layer. Yeah, which yeah, then might also grow faster. So the mechanism through which this becomes more important is then differential growth. And yeah, like gradually this might also change then the existing city neighborhood at a certain point. At the boundaries, people rather also want small single family houses and not the existing buildings. And layering is again a gradual process through which yeah, you can change yeah, very path-dependent kind of structures such as city development. Last but not least, there's displacement as a mechanism that refers to the slowly rising salience of subordinate relative to dominant institutions. Yeah? So in our housing case, one interesting example here would be condos, right? So basically flats that you can own, which historically, I mean, have always existed also in medieval towns, but they were rather, let's say, a marginal phenomenon in the housing stock in the United States, but also in most European countries. But about, yeah, in the mid 20th century in the United States in the 1960s, then condominiums were rediscovered as a way to make home ownership, in this case of flats, also accessible to lower income parts of the population, or also to attract young urban professionals back into the cities out of their single family houses. Um, So what you do here, that in a way you reactivate an old institution that is dormant, and basically rediscover it in order to shift part of the housing stock away from the existing one and into condominium ownership. Okay, so and that is part of also this rising trend of home ownership. So basically, with these 5 different processes of or types of institutional change, we can explain why home ownership rates increased, why social housing rates decreased simultaneously here ever since at least the 1960s, 70s. And these are all, let's say, explanations that the more classical path dependence explanations would not be able to come up with, just because they predict too much stability over time. Okay, so one final domain that I want to turn to, where historical sociology makes sense, is the varieties of capitalism approach. This is an approach basically to explain why across similarly, let's say, developed countries, the type of institutions that govern capitalism are still different. And the background of this approach, which was suggested here by the Harvard political scientist Peter Hall and the neo-Keynesian economist David Soskice in their path-breaking volume and introduction here, Varieties of Capitalism in 2001. So the background of this is that with basically the beginning of the 1990s and the end of the USSR, it seemed as if there was only one economic system left. Yeah, so I mean, Fukuyama, as you probably know, basically has this statement about the end of history and basically democracy being the only political system in town, and capitalism then was thought to be the only economic system in town. And this approach here, VOC as it is abbreviated, also basically just opposed this statement by saying, well, if you take a closer look at just Western capitalist economies, and then also all of the global South economies, I mean, the Asian tigers catching up, also sort of most African regimes switching to capitalism and globalization, then you do find very intricate differences between the institutions that govern capitalism. And the main differences were boiled down into basically a twofold typology by the authors, namely the opposition between so-called coordinated market economies, or CMEs, and liberal market economies, or LMEs. Yeah? And the cases that best exemplified these two types, not perhaps coincidentally, for the authors were Germany and the United States, respectively. So Germany being sort of the key example for illustrating what a CME, coordinated market economy, is, and the United States being one of the key examples to illustrate what an LME, or liberal market economy, is. And the starting point for this typology was the simple question of how firms and capitalism are able to get, let's say, the 4 main coordination problems solved that they need to have solved in order to do business. Yeah, and this is how to get well-trained workers. Second, how to get capital. Third, how to manage relationships with workers. Yeah, so labor conflicts, industrial relations. And fourth, then how to organize competition, how to deal with other sort of B2B competitors. And the authors describe this in terms of a rational choice institutionalist problem. So these firms are rational actors, they're self-interested, they want to make profit. They try to optimize their means in order to reach this goal of making profit. And they come up with different, let's say, institutional solutions to solve these like 4 different problems, but they do so differently in the United States in comparison to Germany. Yeah. So let's take a look at these 4 different spheres in which companies have to solve coordination problems, um, where in each of these spheres, so let's take a look at these 4 different spheres in which companies try to solve coordination problems in the VOC approach, where then countries determine which kind of collective institution the firms develop. And in these following sort of 4 spheres, then the first sort of solution always refers back here to the coordinated market economies, or what you find in, let's say, the German political economy. And the second element then refers to what you rather find in the liberal market economies as solution. So first problem for companies is how to acquire a skilled labor force. And in this particular case, what then the German companies have been doing, and I refer back here to Kathy Phelan's book about how institutions evolve, is to set up collective vocational training systems which are co-financed by the so-called social partners, so unions and employers associations getting together in the state and creating, yeah, basically a schooling system plus a sort of in-company kind of internships in order to create very specialized skills. Yeah? So specialized skills which allow then companies to produce also very specialized high quality products. And this is different when compared to the United States or LMEs, where there's no such collective institutions, where the collective institutions such as the high school or colleges just produce, let's say, a general level of skills that is not specific to a certain sector, which is then complemented in companies by so-called on-the-job training. So in a way, companies then individually solve their skill problem in their respective companies by on-the-job training, but do not finance like a collective sort of institution such as the vocational training system. That also means that in the German system, the employees are much more, let's say, dependent on their skill use in a given sector or even firm, yeah, because they have very specialized kind of skills. Whereas in the United States, then employees have rather general skill level, and they are more likely then also to just change their employer and just work as a different employer, because in a way their premium on the skills is not as high at a given workplace as it is in Germany. So this was how companies then sort of get workers. Here is how they get money, and we already know this distinction from the Gerschenkron example. So in, again, the LMEs, it is more likely the case that stock markets or securities markets finance companies, whereas in the German case, it is much more through universal banking. Yeah, and this has huge implications for how, let's say, patient the capital is. So stock markets are usually set to have a short-term perspective or investment horizon, and these universal banks are rather willing to give out also long-term loans to companies. And allow companies to have a much longer kind of planning horizon. They also sit on the boards of companies, so the supervisory boards, so they have much better information also on the companies they invest in when compared to the more anonymous stock market, which is why then the German coordinated market economies have also been described as one where investors and companies have much more of an arm's length relationship when compared to the distant relationship between stock market investors and companies in the American liberal market economy. Okay, so vocational training, corporate finance, we have already seen this before. This is a new element now, which also is not surprising to you. So in the coordinated market economies or Germany, you have unions and employer associations that usually negotiate collectively labor contracts, and there's also legal protection of jobs, so there's job security. And this is very much opposed to the relative weakness of unions and employer associations in the United States or liberal market economies, where it's much more like a hiring, firing kind of labor market, and where wages are much more individualized. So one, let's say, a side effect of this is also that companies in Germany are much more involved in common associations, like these employer associations for wage setting, but also for other activities, than it is the case in the United States, where also, let's say, antitrust institutions, as Kathy Thielen has shown, have actively tried to make companies not sort of mingle in employers' associations. And this brings me to the fourth dimension, by which then the companies in the different varieties of capitalisms diverge, which is how basically firms act collectively in order to set standards in industries, right? So, how sort of big does a tire need to be in the automobile industry in order to work for all different kinds of cars, etc. And to work collectively also on technological development. And the opposition for the CMEs, LMEs in this case is that in the German case, there's, I mean, already through the employers associations, but then also on the level of industrial associations, much more collaborative effort in setting standards in a given industry and in developing technology jointly for common use. Whereas in the United States, the standard setting is much more driven by just market competition, right? If there's a dominant firm around, it sets the standards and the others have to follow. So there's not really any sort of cooperation there. And where in the US, then antitrust institutions have made collaboration basically cross firms in a given sector much more difficult than in Germany, which basically leads to technological transfer being often made possible actually through poaching of employees from other companies, or also just through this hire and fire labor market, where there's a lot of more turnover in the workforce of a given company, because there's much less security to keep one's positions, as would be the case in the German sort of coordinated market economy. So these are the four different spheres, and I will briefly return to them in a second. So the authors of this varieties of capitalism approach then say that these are different ways of doing capitalism, different institutions, and both types can be equally successful. I mean, they have been around for sort of a century already and moved in parallel, and they may be stable, sort of multiple equilibria. Which also implies that, well, there might not be universal benchmark solutions to do capitalism the right way. So if you want to transplant an institution from a CME into an LME, like to come up with a union, for instance, in a state like Texas, the way that unions exist in Germany might not work perfectly. Or in other terms, these four spheres of different institutions might develop complementarities such that they work best in their institutional environment. This is where they can create synergies. And this means that if a firm, for instance, from an CME, wants to be efficient in a CME environment, it needs to institutionally adopt also to this environment. Otherwise, it might not be able to compete. Yeah. So to see a bit clearer which kinds of complementarities, functional, institutional complementarities between the different institutional spheres there are, let us take a look at this graph here from the optional reading, which here on the left-hand side describes these four different spheres, right, that we talked about for the American liberal market economy. This time, but also with basically the functional complementarities between the different parts. And on the right-hand side, we see these four different spheres, right? So this is skill, this is corporate finance, this is sort of collective association between employers, and this is industrial relations, with the institutional complementarities for the case of the German coordinated market economy. Yeah. So let's start perhaps here in the German CME and talk about the American case a bit in the shadow. So in Germany, as we saw, there's this collective vocational training system that produces high-skilled workers. This is obviously a very long-term investment. So LR here is like long run and refers to the need for such a system to be adequately also financed, which requires a more long-term focus also of finance, which, as you see, then neatly fits with the more long-term focus of bank-based kind of finance in the German system, right, where the banks have a supervisory board membership in the companies they invest in. So they basically know the long-term investment strategy. Yeah. And this just describes one of these functional complementarities. Another complementarity is the one between the union-based kind of industrial relations in the German case and the skill system, where, I mean, if you're an individual worker, you put yourself at risk if you invest in too specific skills of such a vocational training system, instead of just relying on your general skills, where you can leave your company and just go to a different one, as it is the case here for the United States. So what the worker needs in return is job security, which is something then that the unions are able to negotiate in collective labor market agreements, where they do not just set basically an industry level wage, but also make sure that, let's say, job security is maintained for these highly specialized kind of workers. And this is then different. I mean, these sort of complementarities in comparison to the US system, where the more general skill production without that vocational training system rather works together with the labor market, where you do hiring and firing in the absence of unions, where, I mean, if a worker is dissatisfied with a certain job, the unspecificity of the skills allow the worker to go to just a different company. Yeah? So this worker mobility and the poaching of worker by other companies are also what basically produce a complementarity in the US case here between deregulated labor markets and the transfer of basically knowledge in a given industry, which happens through workers' high circulation and turnover rates within the industry. So there's basically the standard setting and knowledge transfer is made through the workers. In the German case, by contrast, the complementarity is rather working through the employers' sort of associations, the industry-wide collaboration, which is necessary because the seniority levels in German companies are much higher due to the union and wage protection. Then employees are rather likely to stay with the same company, which makes it more difficult for companies to poach workers or for workers to just go to a different company, bring their sort of knowledge and sort of standards with them and make knowledge circulate in the industry. As this is not an option in the German case, it's rather working through the collaboration of firms in like within industry associations themselves. Okay. So I won't go through all of the functional complementarities. I just highlighted the probably most important ones, but you see already that for an institution such as union negotiated contracts in a given industry to work, it needs also complementary institutions in the same political economy. And this is an important takeaway of the varieties of capitalism approach. So to sum up, let's focus on what makes the historical sociology analysis of institutions then different from perhaps its main competitor, the rational choice institutionalism. You recall the rational choice institutionalism from the micro-sociological lecture, where we opposed the so-called sociological institutionalism to rational choice institutionalism. The third institutionalism around, so the third approach to define and analyze institutions in sociology is called historical institutionalism, which is what this lecture has been about. And in this table, we now can oppose rational choice to historical institutionalism, drawing on another interesting article by Kathy Phelan in this case. So historical institutionalism is opposed to rational choice or RC institutionalism in that it is like a much more empirical bottom-up approach. You often deal with a very limited number of cases, so it's a limited N kind of research design. Theda Skocpol's work on the three big revolutions, Chinese, Russian, French, an entire book on three cases. Then Mahoney, for instance, worked on the 5 Central American countries and why they ended up with different regimes in the 20th century. So limited number of cases, very empirical work, a maximum of so-called only mid-range or middle range theories. And this is opposed to RC institutionalism, where it's often about model building. It's not even empirical cases. If it's empirical at all, it's large N, so many countries, many firms, but it's mostly sort of top-down modeling. Another difference between the two kinds of institutionalisms is how to think about individuals and about how their preferences are shaped. And RC institutionalism basically takes this anthropology of the self-interested, rational sort of actor as given, where changes in preferences can only be explained exogenously, that is, not from within the model itself. Rules, values, and so on only appear as external constraints in actors' utility functions in this case. And this is very different from the historical institutionalist way of looking at actors, where basically actors are historically embedded. The historical context shapes the preferences and also changes preferences. And they're very much dependent on the context and norms and values that are determined also by the institutions that govern in a given society. The explanatory level and level of analysis is different in the two approaches. You may have noticed that historical institutionalism really asks the big questions. Why do revolutions occur? What drives regime change? Why do capitalism systems differ across countries? So really big questions. And it is taken for granted that explanations can work on the macro level, even without a so-called micro foundation, so without going too much into individual level explanations. This is very different in RC institutionalism, where explaining something through the micro level is sort of the gold standard, and macro explanations are not really considered without micro foundation. So the definition of what an institution is also differs across these different types of institutionalism. Historical institutionalism sees institutions as just historical constructions. They can be chance productions and therefore be inefficient, not necessarily, but it is very likely. RC institutionalism then sees institutions as just functional solutions to actors' collective action problems, and existing institutions are efficient. Otherwise, actors would basically get rid of them. And you may have noticed that rational choice institutionalism is what is also the micro foundation of the varieties of capitalism approach, where it's not individuals but firms being represented in a model of self-interested rational actors. So part of the critique that historical institutionalists would make about rational choice institutionalism also affects the varieties of capitalism approach. The two different institutionalisms also have different ideas about how institutions change. And we saw above that historical institutionalists have this path dependence notion of change, where change is basically just coming in waves of shocks, like radical, critical junctures, etc. And we saw also that there's a more incremental model of change proposed by Kathy Thiel and Wolfgang Streeck, where we have these 5 different types of gradual changes in long processes. This is different in the RC institutionalist world, where the models are mainly general equilibrium models that can only be changed through a radical external shock, an exogenous change of preference. Last but not least, we encountered a number of authors in the historical institutionalist camp here already in the footnotes. So Kathy Thiel is probably one of the most central authors in the current day. Theda Skocpol is still around. And some of the RC institutionalists actually figure in the footnotes also of your economics lectures. So you may take a look at that. Okay, so we leave it here. So a brief summary is there are 3 different institutionalisms. So sociological attempts to analyze institutions. We encountered the sociological institutionalism in the second lecture. RC institutionalism has always been here in the background. And in this lecture, you learned about the historical institutionalism with its important concept of path dependency and one of its main applications, which is to understand differences in capitalist institutions and developments, one branch of which is the so-called varieties of capitalism approach. Okay, with this, have a great day.